At first glance, it's pretty clear who the good guys are and who the bad guys are in The Lord of the Rings. It's the same at second glance, third glance, and even fourth glance. All that said, sometimes you have some people who paint a different picture. Sometimes it's satirical or a thought experiment, such as the book The Last Ringbearer by Russian paleontologist Kirill Yeskov. But sometimes on the internet, you genuinely do find people who argue that Sauron might have been the good guy, or at the very least was misunderstood. So let's answer the question, was Sauron misunderstood? Before I start, I just want to say that this video isn't me finding an article or theory and debunking it point by point, because, in my opinion, you can't argue that Sauron was the good guy without coming across as someone who was either a clown or someone who has severely demented views. Because this is a guy that was comically evil. He looked evil, he lived in an ominous tower in a volcanic wasteland, he took pleasure in cruelty, he corrupted nature, he made extensive use of slaves, he allegedly made use of biological warfare, and he didn't mind committing a bit of genocide. Arguing with someone about whether Sauron was good or not is like arguing with someone who believes that 2 + 2 is 5, the earth is flat, or that pineapple belongs on pizza. But maybe, just maybe, you could claim that Sauron was just misunderstood in a way. Maybe you could argue that he had decent intentions in the beginning and just got a little bit mixed up along the way. Maybe you could argue that he did occasionally do good things, which is proof of the fact that he still did ultimately have a desire to do good. Maybe you could argue that the fact that he had so many followers is proof that he couldn't have been as bad as people believed. Or maybe you could even argue that while Sauron was bad, his enemies are also bad because many of them had their own viewpoints and practices that we in modern society might not look so kindly upon. Let's start with Sauron's intentions. Now, Tolkien makes Sauron's motives very clear. Sauron is all about order. He wants everything modeled and done in a way that maximizes efficiency, and he hates the idea of wasted energy. So you could make the argument that Sauron's intentions were noble because he wanted everything to reach its full potential. Why have a chaotic world with all of its associated problems when you could have a perfectly ordered world where all energy is directed towards the one goal? Couldn't you then have a world where everyone prospers, is safe, and has purpose? There's obviously problems with this, the major one being, doesn't a perfectly ordered world mean the loss of true freedom? But I'm not looking to get into the philosophy of it, but rather the greater context around Sauron's desire. Because when and how Sauron chooses to act on this desire is incredibly important because it kind of proves that for Sauron, it was never about some noble cause like desiring to make the world a better place. No, it was for entirely selfish reasons, such as a desire for power. Firstly, Sauron joins Morgoth, the first Dark Lord. He does this because he believes that he can operate more freely and execute his own designs under Morgoth, as opposed to the Valar who have a lot more red tape, or rather they would probably not be too pleased about some of his ideas and methods. What makes this incredibly hypocritical from Sauron is that Morgoth's motives are fundamentally opposed to his own. Morgoth is all about chaos and destruction, which obviously goes against Sauron's order. Sauron choosing to serve under him shows that he isn't on some moral crusade, and that his beliefs are actually quite flexible if it means he gets a bit more power and autonomy. And when Sauron joins Morgoth is also important. He does it very early in Arda's history, before even a fraction of Iluvatar's grand tapestry has played out. So you can't really argue that Sauron is some burned believer who watched the Valar and the later children of Iluvatar seemingly fumble the grand design and come to the conclusion that he could do it better. No, he switched sides straight away, assuming that his plans were the best, without giving anyone a chance to prove him otherwise. This just further proves that his fall into evil was due to selfishness and pride. Okay, but ignoring his intentions and the reason for his fall, didn't Sauron do good on occasion? Well, yes, sort of, very rarely. Before Sauron fell to evil, he was described as a craftsman who was second only to Aule himself, so presumably he probably created some pretty cool things. But after his fall to evil, I can really only think of 2 good things that Sauron actually contributed to, one of them being indirectly and the other being directly, but also not for good reasons. The direct help is for the men of Middle-earth in the early Second Age. These men are fairly backwards, they've never known the light of the Valar, and the only thing that they have known, Morgoth, is gone. Sauron swoops in and teaches them some useful things such as stonework and metalwork so that they can craft proper weapons and build proper walls for themselves. This is a nice thing to do because regardless of their past, many of these groups of men are victims of circumstance. Many of them have been oppressed by Morgoth and his servants, and their growth and worldviews are completely stunted. But Sauron isn't doing this out of the goodness of his heart. He doesn't actually really care for men. In fact, he looks upon them with a fair bit of disdain, viewing domination over the elves as the true prize. However, he also recognizes that he needs servants and that he needs them to be useful, which is why he teaches them the things that he does. And when he's teaching them, he positions himself as a god to be worshipped and obeyed, not as a friend or a teacher. So yeah, while Sauron does help some of the men of Middle-earth, he's helping them so that they can help him, and ultimately they end up making up a great deal of his armies during the ages. The other time where Sauron sort of helped was during the creation of the Rings of Power. During his time in Eregion, Sauron did teach the Elven-smiths a lot about craftsmanship and magic, and they would go on to create a lot of cool minor artifacts. The greatest of the major artifacts were the 3 Elven Rings, Nenya, Narya, and Vilya, which had the power to preserve and postpone the decay of the Elven realms, among other things. These rings are what allowed places like Rivendell and Lothlorien to remain so magical even until the end of the Third Age, and there's an argument that could be made that without them, many elves would have left Middle-earth far earlier, perhaps by choice, but possibly even by necessity. But once again, this wasn't Sauron being nice. In fact, he did not directly help with the 3 Elven Rings, which is why they were the only good rings. Sauron's intentions with the Rings of Power were always dark. His other rings, the 7 and the 9, were crafted for the elves specifically so Sauron could dominate them. Each of them had a backdoor which could be accessed when Sauron crafted and wore the one ring, and through this backdoor, Sauron intended to dominate the wearers, who were meant to be the greatest of the elves, and then use them to gain control over the elves as a whole. The reason the elves became aware of this treachery was because they created the 3, which Sauron also believed was treachery. So yeah, while Sauron technically helped, it was unintentional and it ended up completely backfiring against him. Okay, so we've established that Sauron's motives were never really good, and that on the very rare occasions he helped, he either did so unintentionally, or he did so with ulterior motives. But if he was truly that terrible, then why did he have so many followers? After all, those who opposed Sauron and Middle-earth were actually a minority. The vast majority of the peoples of the East and South were firm, sometimes even fanatic followers of Sauron. If Sauron was the monster that the West portrayed him as, then how come these peoples didn't mass rebel against him? The answer here is multi-leveled. Firstly, you must understand the limited perspective that many of Sauron's servants had, and the insane amount of propaganda they were effectively bombarded with for thousands of years. Most of the men of Middle-earth had little to no interaction with the elves, let alone the Valar, so the narrative about them was entirely controlled by Morgoth and later Sauron. We see this in the tale of Tal Elmar. From Tal Elmar's perspective, that of an indigenous man of the coastlands of Middle-earth, the elves are described as the Cruels of the North. A people that might be identified as the Northmen are described as the Fell Folk, and the Númenóreans are terrifying men who worship death. But you might say, well, hold up, even if the peoples of the West were victims of propaganda, these people still should have recognized that Sauron was evil, right? I mean, he lived in a volcanic wasteland and employed foul creatures such as orcs. Well, yeah, some people did rebel against him. Many of these were organized by the Blue Wizards, and they were actually effective enough to hinder Sauron's war plans. And unfortunately, many of these brave rebels paid with their lives or suffered other cruel fates such as working the fields of Nirn to feed Sauron's armies. Most people, however, did serve Sauron, but they didn't do so because Sauron was secretly nice to them in a way that the West never observed. Many remained wholly ignorant of Sauron's true nature. After all, Sauron did originally wander around in a fair form and dispensed gifts among his servants. He wasn't exactly going around and announcing himself as a Dark Lord. We also see this in Tal Elmar. Tal Elmar himself seems like a normal, well-adjusted person, but he still worships Sauron. That's because he doesn't have any idea who or what Sauron is. He doesn't even know his true name. As for those who were less ignorant, there's still explanations. When it comes to individuals, there were probably many who recognized that Sauron was a little bit evil, but to them, power was more important, so they were willing to be morally flexible if it meant acquiring more. But there's also the possibility that while many were well aware of Sauron and his actions, they didn't consider it evil because it was normal to them. Many groups of men were fervent worshippers of Morgoth from the very beginning, so they were practicing cruelty such as slavery and human sacrifice for thousands of years. To them, it might not have been evil, it might just have been normal, a way of life, the reality of the world. And finally, Sauron did get some outside help. He painted the West in a bad light, and eventually the Númenóreans proved him partially correct. They started arriving on the shores of Middle-earth with massive fleets, and oppressed the men of Middle-earth by stealing their lands, wealth, and eventually even their people. While Sauron was also a tyrant, to many he might have been seen as the lesser evil or even a saviour of sorts, and by allying with him and serving him, they might be able to throw the Númenóreans back into the sea. So while there's a lot of explanations as to why most of the men of the East and South served Sauron, none of them are, Sauron is actually a really nice guy at home. It was just a matter of thousands of years of propaganda and deception that warped the viewpoints of those men. It was normalizing awful practices in their cultures, so they didn't really look at Sauron as practicing anything overly evil himself. And finally, it was Sauron presenting himself as the better option when actual enemies arrived on their doorsteps. Finally, let's talk about how Sauron compared to his enemies and whether we can rehabilitate his image based on the fact that his enemies were not as good as they claimed to be. The unfortunate reality is that the Númenóreans and their descendants did do some bad things. Even while good, they had hostile run-ins with native men and even caused some fairly bad ecological damage. Later, they practiced an oppressive form of colonialism, even sinking as low as carrying away natives to use as slaves. Even the Gondorians were somewhat imperialist. Although one could argue they were acting in self-defense, they still did occupy foreign lands and exact tribute from foreign peoples for hundreds of years. You could even argue that the Númenórean obsession with racial purity was also a bit dodgy. They had an upper class that consisted of a superior race, and marrying and mixing with lesser men was often seen as a bad thing and was enough to remove you from the line of succession. Gondor even fought a civil war about it at one point, and the only reason why the racial purists lost is because an army of Northmen aided the exiled king in regaining his throne. Now yes, in Tolkien's world-building, the whole racial purity thing is a little bit more complex than the pseudoscience that exists in our own world, but you can understand why Sauron opposing this might make him seem a bit more sympathetic. But the problem with this line of thinking is that Sauron basically did all of the same but worse. Ecocide, Sauron raised the Brown Lands so badly that nothing grew there for thousands of years. Colonialism, Sauron's whole presence in Middle-earth was colonialism, he didn't belong there. Slavery, the Númenóreans only practiced it for a short time, and their Dunedain descendants did not, but Sauron practiced it for thousands of years. Oh, and human sacrifice? Guess who was the one who introduced that to the Númenóreans? As for racial purity, need I remind you that men were Sauron's backup plan. He only used them because he was hated by the elves. And obviously, Sauron did not oppose the Númenóreans because he was against any of their practices, even if that's the image he presented to his own servants. No, he opposed them because they dared to fight against him, and even when he basically briefly ruled over them, he then got them destroyed out of spite. This was the way Sauron acted with everyone. If they dared oppose him or even just refused to submit to him, he would then try and do it by force and would ultimately destroy them if they caused him enough headaches. That is not the modus operandi of anyone who is genuinely doing things for the right reasons. If you've got this far, then thank you, because I will say that anyone who is even somewhat familiar with The Lord of the Rings knows that this isn't a video that needed to be made because Sauron is obviously the bad guy, and there really isn't any redeeming his character. While Tolkien did not believe in absolute evil, Sauron was closer to that than anyone not named Morgoth. So really, I think I made this video for my own entertainment. And I don't know, maybe if you ever see someone defending Sauron in the wild, you can hit them with a point or two from this video, or just basic common sense and maybe a short explanation of what empathy is. Thank you for watching, I hope you enjoyed it or at least found it interesting. I guess I kind of already did an outro in the paragraph before, so I'm not really sure what to say now. How has your week been? Did you get up to anything interesting? Got any cool stories to tell? Maybe a short trauma dump? I don't know. Cheers, farewell, and remember, if someone tells you Sauron is the good guy, you should really befriend that person, because I'm sure they have some other beliefs that are really cool and wholesome.